Eliza paced to the narrow corridor under the city in anxious curiosity, her booted feet stirring ancient dust that had lain undisturbed for centuries. She clutched a map in her trembling hand, a map she had risked her entire academic reputation to obtain. By day, she was just another postgraduate researcher at the local university, specializing in archaeological cryptography. But tonight, she was no mere scholar. She was an explorer, headed into the shadows beneath the world she knew. The place reeked of secrets and stale air, and her heart pounded with equal parts fear and fascination. In the flickering glow of the lantern she carried, the walls glistened with dampness. Rumor had it that, beneath this segment of the city, somewhere in a subterranean labyrinth, older than any building above ground, rested a hidden vault that ought never to have been disturbed. Tales whispered of haunting glyphs scrawled into the very stone, words ceaselessly warning the living to stay away. Then there were the older legends, ominous stories so obscure that most historians brushed them off as the delirium of superstitious peasants. But Eliza could not dismiss these stories so easily. Her dreams had been haunted by half-forgotten symbols and labyrinthine passages, and she felt herself pulled toward this hidden realm, convinced she stood on the precipice of a discovery that could redefine the city's history. Perhaps she had been too brazen, ignoring the warnings etched into tattered manuscripts and downplayed in lectures she attended. Even so, each step she took deeper into the tunnels felt fated. At last, she found the central corridor, described in the clandestine notes she'd deciphered. The corridor was arched, cathedral-like, its ceiling spangled with dusty cobwebs. Within the stillness, she could almost hear faint echoes of chanting, though there was nothing but silent stone stretched out before her. Heart fluttering, she peered at the map once more. If the cryptic instructions had been correct, she was mere steps away from a vault sealed centuries ago. Her breath turned ragged, and she dared not guess what she might find behind its door. A few more paces revealed a massive iron gate, imposing and cold, its surface eaten away by rust. A sealed door behind it bore an eerie emblem, a serpent devouring its own tail, a symbol of infinity. With hands shaking, Eliza used a crowbar to pry aside the gate's corroded old lock. The metal shrieked, the echo reverberating through the passage. An intoxicating mix of dread and exhilaration coursed through her as she pressed forward and pushed at the door. It groaned open, unveiling a chamber so dark that her lantern's glow seemed swallowed by the gloom. She stepped inside cautiously. The stench was overpowering, a rancid odor, musty as if the place had never known fresh air. Her lantern cast elliptical beams of light, revealing thick columns chiseled with runic symbols that tangled across the stone. She recognized a few from eclectic texts of arcane languages that she had studied. Though they typically denoted warnings of curses, the webs of script here felt far more sinister. She swallowed hard. It was one thing to read about ill portents in a safe library. It was another to stand amidst them. In the center stood the object of her fascination and terror, a sarcophagus carved from some unidentifiable black stone that glimmered faintly even in the low light. Its surface teemed with inscribed glyphs, intricately formed like serpents coiling into knots, their heads forming the words of a dead language. To Eliza's amazement, the etchings almost seemed alive, winding around the slab's edges. She found herself stepping closer. A low hum, as if resonating from the stone itself, danced just at the edge of her hearing. She hesitated. No records named the occupant of this coffin, and no official archives mentioned it, but in hushed, incomplete references. Was it a tyrant from a forgotten era? A malevolent priest entombed alive for orchestrating dark rites? Or, her mind whispered, a relic of a civilization whose magic had not died with time? Eliza knew she should proceed with caution, but curiosity burned inside her. She placed a careful hand on the carved surface, and the stone was far colder than the damp air around her. Beneath her fingertips, a small portion of the glyphs was rough to the touch, their lines carefully gouged, so that each symbol pressed into her mind. She shuddered involuntarily. Minutes later, not entirely certain why she did so, she began to rub away centuries of grit from a particular cluster of glyphs near the lid's center. Flicking open a worn leather journal, she cross-referenced scrawled translations she had painstakingly compiled over months. She whispered them haltingly, words she had never spoken aloud, sinister phrases in a language whose consonants snagged at her tongue. The chamber's air grew heavier with each syllable. She felt the atmosphere shift as if, in speaking these words, she had cued some ancient watcher to stir. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a trembling among the cobwebs strung across the lofty ceiling. A draft, she reasoned. Yet a small voice in her head insisted that the stirring was not a mere gust of wind. She repeated more of the chant in a moment of reckless bravado, and the black stone beneath her hand seemed to vibrate, responding to her recitation. The runes on the sarcophagus all at once appeared more pronounced, sharper, pulsing faintly with an unearthly luminescence that lit the crypt like a lantern would cast glimmers on a cavern wall. Then, precipitously, there was silence. A single droplet of water echoed from the dripping crypt ceiling. She held her breath, waiting for something else to happen. It did. The bound hinges of the lid emitted an echoing groan, as though responding to an unseen command. Slowly it began to rise. Shocked, Eliza took 2 stumbling steps backward, her eyes wide and heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Something inside that coffin was shifting, pushing. A handpail, vaguely shriveled and undeniably human, curled over the edge of the stone. Nails ragged. When the figure rose, her lantern's light revealed a face devoid of mortal warmth. The eyes were cold, half-lidded, and the flesh drawn taut around the skull. Some sort of ancient burial shroud hung from its body, disintegrating in places, revealing patches of gray, mummified skin. Eliza gasped, stifling a scream. Her logical mind balked at the sight before her. She had read enough to suspect curses and revenants, but to see it come to pass broke the final illusions of safety in her academic pursuits. Staggering back, she clutched her lantern's handle so tightly that her knuckles blanched. The figure rose fully. Thin strands of black hair clung to its scalp, and it moved with a sort of stiff elegance, as though each limb needed to remember how to function after centuries of stillness. It turned its head toward her, and in the emptiness of that gaze, she sensed not mere hunger, but intent. Abruptly, it opened its mouth in a raspy snarl, revealing blackened teeth. Panic seized her, and she backed away, fumbling to find the gate behind her. But as she turned, she realized with dawning horror that this being was not alone. Along the chamber's edges, something else moved. Bodies that had lain crumpled in the vault's corners for who knew how long, perhaps old criminals or unsuspecting explorers, now began to twitch. The glyphs scrawled into the walls gave off a murky luminescence. They seemed to be summoning or commanding the dead within this subterranean realm to rouse from their restless slumber. Eliza ducked as one corpse lurched toward her. She heard its jaw clack shut, inches from her ear. Dropping her lantern, in startled terror, she fled the vault. She flung herself against the iron gate, yanking it open. The corridor beyond was just as dark, but at least she knew the path. Her mind raced. She had loosed an unspeakable evil upon the world, the deathly occupant of the sarcophagus, and whatever animate powers its glyphs contained. She had to find a way to contain it again, she told herself. The old texts hinted at a seal, an incantation to calm the restless dead, if uttered in the correct tongue. But that knowledge was jumbled in her mind, half lost to shock. As she fled, shadowy silhouettes flickered in her periphery. A skeletal figure staggered forward from another corridor, perhaps awakened by the intangible aura the sarcophagus emitted. She skirted around it, feeling her pulse in her ears, and pressed on. After what felt like an eternity weaving through twisting passages, she emerged into a broader space lit by sputtering electric lights that had once been installed for the city's old sewage system. The relative brightness momentarily stung her eyes. She paused briefly to catch her breath, noticing how the undead figures paused at the edges of the darkness, like insects recoiling from harsh illumination. She needed help, and she knew it. But who would believe her? No official agency would take her word seriously if she told them about reanimated corpses in the catacombs and a cursed sarcophagus. Still, she couldn't stand by while the city slept above a rising tide of horrors. In the gloom of that subterranean thoroughfare, her mind jumped at once to two figures she might trust. One was Dr. Emilio Klein, a reclusive epitapher who had published obscure articles about necromantic scripts across Mesoamerican and Mesopotamian cultures. Another was Arthur Marsh, a local historian rumored to be a member of some secret society devoted to guarding arcane relics. Both men were somewhat outcast in academic circles. Dr. Klein for his eccentric beliefs, Marsh for his unorthodox methods, and both possessed knowledge that might match the severity of the threat. She resolved to contact them, no matter how insane her story sounded. It took her until the following evening to gather her nerves and locate Dr. Klein. She found him in his dimly lit study at the university's basement offices. Old shelves sagged under the weight of ancient texts, and the sharp odor of must mingled in the air. The professor listened as she haltingly recounted her tale. The map, the vault, the cryptic glyphs. And the moment life was breathed into death, though at first he regarded her with skeptical, squinting eyes. His expression morphed into that of a man confronted with a truth he had always expected, yet continually hoped to avoid. After a thoughtful pause, he unlocked a small cabinet containing a tattered scroll. He unrolled it across his desk, revealing an array of archaic glyphs that struck Eliza as similar to those she had seen on the sarcophagus. These are binding incantations, he explained, his fingertips hovering above the parchment. They reference the concept of sending the dead back to their rightful domain. But they also speak of an artifact, a central talisman, used to maintain the boundary between the living and the dead. He shrugged feebly. I always assumed it was metaphorical. Now, I'm not so sure. She opened her journal, showing him her own partial translations, gleaned from her foray into the vault. Dr. Klein peered at them intently. It's definitely the same script, albeit with certain regional variations, he said. These symbols, they're fueling the reanimation. But there's a key line here about reversing the process by reciting a phrase in the presence of the central artifact. Eliza closed her eyes, recalling the black sarcophagus. A wave of dread coursed through her at the realization that she would have to return. Dr. Klein studied her frightened face and gave a small nod of understanding. You've set something in motion, he said kindly, but you can still stop it. He then scribbled a set of runes onto a notepad. Memorize these words. They won't be easy to pronounce, but your voice should resonate with the energy that started all this. She felt tears prick the edges of her eyes, fear and shame both gnawing at her. I'll do it, she said, voice tight. But we'll need more support, or we won't even get close enough. A few phone calls later, she managed to persuade Arthur Marsh of the seriousness of the threat. Marsh, with a steely calm that unnerved Eliza, arrived at Dr. Klein's office carrying a small duffel. He quietly explained its contents: flares, rope, and a battered amulet, rumored to be a relic from the Crusades that some believed could ward off the hungry dead. Dr. Klein eyed the amulet skeptically, but there was no time to argue niceties. They realized they had to venture back into the underground labyrinth immediately. Reports were already surfacing of missing vagrants near old sewer entrances, and strange sightings of sagging, shambling figures lumbering beneath the city's manhole covers. It was night again when the trio descended climb-worn steps into the gloom. Marsh carried an electric torch, Dr. Klein bore a large flashlight, and Eliza clutched her lantern, along with the scrawled incantation. The deeper they went, the quieter their voices became, as though even speaking might awaken something. They reached the old corridors where the electric lighting gave way to utter darkness. The gloom pressed in around them, thick and suffocating, and it was only through Marsh's memory of the city's subterranean blueprint that they traversed the labyrinth. They turned a corner onto a narrow passage, only to recoil at the sight of a figure stumbling toward them. With a beam of Marsh's torch, they saw it clearly. A man in a tattered suit, his face partially decayed, an odor of rot rolling off him. Instinctively, Marsh raised his duffel's amulet, muttering a phrase under his breath. The creature gnashed its blackened teeth and let out a hiss, then halted, as if uncertain. Dr. Klein seized the moment to swing a crowbar at its torso, knocking it to the ground. Without waiting to see if it rose again, they hurried onward. Their footsteps echoed through the damp halls. Time became amorphous in the catacombs, each twist and turn melding into the next. The deeper they went, the more undead thralls they encountered, each bearing a different story of how they perished. Some still wearing remnants of old military uniforms, others in modern clothes. A fair number feebly clawed at them, only to be stymied by the amulet or hammered back by the crowbar. Anxiety weighed heavy on Eliza's chest. Her knowledge was the cause of all this, yet if she failed to contain it, the entire city would devolve into a walking graveyard. At last, in the dank corridor leading to the iron gate, Eliza noted a soft glow on the walls. The runes etched into the stones were all alight, throbbing with malevolent energy. The sense of presence was overwhelming, as if unseen eyes were tracking their every movement. When they reached the gate, Dr. Klein and Marsh turned to Eliza. She nodded, steeling herself. Her voice quivered, but she insisted they continue. They swung the gate open to find the vault in even worse shape than she remembered. Dust and rubble littered the floor, and the black sarcophagus stood with its lid fully displaced. At its base knelt the gaunt figure that had first emerged the night before, robed in a rotting cloth. Behind it, at least a dozen undead figures, some little more than skeletons, gathered in macabre reverence. The faint pulsing of the glyphs cast flickering shadows, making it appear as if the dead were dancing. In the center of the ruins, a swirling patch of darkness hovered in the air, a misty gateway, or perhaps a manifestation of the power fueling this unholy congregation. The lead figure pivoted its skull-like visage toward them, its lips stretched in a smile that was both triumphant and monstrous. Marsh raised the torch, the bright beam illuminating its hollow eyes. Dr. Klein braced himself, crowbar in hand, while Eliza, trembling, tried to recall the incantation. Her mouth felt parched, yet she sensed the rightness in uttering these words, a cosmic force that demanded correction. One step forward, then another. She positioned herself in front of the black sarcophagus, the robed horror mere feet away, flanked by slavering undead minions. No sooner did she open her mouth than the robed figure hissed, ordering the undead forward. They shuffled closer, arms extended. Marsh and Dr. Klein intervened, shouting as they swung their meager weapons. Glares from the duffel spat red light and smoke, forming a ring of harsh brightness around the group, momentarily holding the hellish legion at bay. Eliza clutched her notepad, scanning the glyphs scrawled by Dr. Klein. With a deep breath, she began the incantation, guttural phonemes clattering from her lips, each syllable a battered attempt to speak that long-dead language accurately. A surge of force rippled through the chamber, as though her voice had tugged on some invisible cord. The undead hissed and retreated a step, confusion flitting across their glazed eyes. Emboldened, she continued, voice gaining strength. The robed figure shrieked, raising a skeletal arm as if to strike her down, but Marsh rushed forward, brandishing the amulet. The ancient relic glowed with a surprising brilliance, and the figure recoiled, stumbling as though burnt by sunlight. Eliza pressed on, pouring as much will as she could into the complicated verse. The swirling black mist above the sarcophagus started churning, the malicious energy swirling faster, cracking like thunder. A wave of nausea hit her, nearly knocking her to her knees. She steadied herself, aware that she needed to finish the chant to seal the undead away. Marsh screamed in pain as two corpses grappled with him. Dr. Klein wrested one away with the crowbar, but the scene cluttered into a chaotic whirl of limbs and surging shadows. Something clawed at Eliza's shoulder, yanking her backward. She lost her grip on the notepad, but she remembered the next line. Dizzily, she shrieked the words into the darkness. The thing that grabbed her let out a strangled roar, and its hold slackened. Glowing lines on the sarcophagus flared white, and the robed figure released an unearthly howl. A potent gust of wind whipped through the vault, funneling dust and shards of the black stone in a fervent cyclone. Eliza's hair whipped around her face as she repeated the final passage of the incantation, voice ragged from the strain. All at once, the swirling darkness that hung above the sarcophagus collapsed in on itself like a dying star, leaving only a faint, shimmering halo. The glyphs etched into the walls pulsed once more, then dimmed. One by one, the animate corpses slumped to the floor as though their strings had been cut. Their eyes went blank, and they ceased writhing. Marsh, battered and bleeding, rolled out from under two fallen bodies and scrambled to his knees. Dr. Klein, panting, leaned against a column, crowbar still in hand. Eliza hovered near the sarcophagus, swaying with exhaustion. The robed figure, its face twisted in a final mask of fury, collapsed beside the black coffin, no longer a vessel of unholy energy. The crisis, for now, was over. In the deafening stillness that followed, Eliza could hardly absorb what had occurred. The vault around them was filled with the quiet of true death. The cursed sarcophagus, though still physically present, seemed robbed of its dreadful aura, its surface dull and lifeless. Marsh rubbed a swollen bruise on his jaw, while Dr. Klein slowly made his way to Eliza's side. He was breathing heavily behind his glasses, eyes full of relief. "We have to ensure it can't be used again," Marsh said in a hoarse whisper. "This entire chamber should be sealed." Eliza nodded, slumping to the floor. "We will. No one else can ever set foot here." She gazed at the black coffin, a grim reminder that some corners of history were never meant to be unearthed. "I'll report a structural collapse down here," Marsh volunteered. "And we'll get the city to seal every entrance. We'll bury this place alive." Dr. Klein stared at them both, removing his glasses and wiping the lenses with shaking fingers. "This knowledge, these writesome things, are too dangerous to be left in dusty books." He turned his gaze to Eliza. "We must make sure that any record of these passages is destroyed as well." Eliza felt a pang of sadness at the thought of erasing so much knowledge, but the images of how the undead had stirred at her words remained seared in her mind. She understood that some learnings were a poison to the mortal soul. They said nothing more as they set about scattering the bones and moldering remains into piles, handling them delicately to ensure no accidental incitement. The battered amulet Marsh carried still glowed faintly, as if feeding on the residue of vile energies dispersed within the vault. Working together, they pushed the stone lid back atop the cursed coffin, etching a final ward in white chalk across its surface. Its power might be temporary, but it would hold long enough for the city to seal the site for good. When at last they emerged from the underground world, the sky was beginning to lighten, the deep velvet of night giving way to a sober gray. Each was covered in dust and smeared with grime. Streaks of sweat ran down their faces. For a moment, none spoke. They looked over their shoulders at the silent city, each grappling with the realization that everything above had remained blissfully unaware of the battle waged beneath the streets. The hum of distant traffic and pre-dawn birdsong stood in stark contrast to the horrors of the labyrinth below. Marsh walked off with a determined stance, presumably heading directly to city officials, weaving some plausible explanation that would see the catacombs fully bricked over. Dr. Klein paused, giving Eliza a solemn nod. "Our secrecy is vital," he said, voice trembling with leftover adrenaline. "But I trust you'll do what must be done with your research." Eliza gripped her tattered journal, recalling the incantation that had spilled from her mouth like venom. Could she simply delete those months of work from her records? She shut her eyes. Yes, she must. Some discoveries should remain undone for the sake of all living souls. Reluctantly, she offered Dr. Klein the notebook of translations. With a pained half-smile, he took it and slid it reverently into his coat pocket. They parted ways without further ceremony. In the days that followed, the city officials posted notices about dangerous sinkholes downtown, promptly hiring a demolition crew to pour concrete into the unstable tunnels. The catacombs were deemed off-limits, sealed behind heavy metal shutters and cement barriers. Rumors emerged of hidden artifacts and lost souls, but no formal statements confirmed anything aside from structural issues. Eliza watched the trucks deposit yards of cement into the subterranean void. She found it surprisingly difficult to watch the living city fully disconnect from its shadowy underbelly. Yet the memory of cold, brittle fingers clutching at her arms and the cold gaze of the mummified occupant within the black sarcophagus convinced her that this was the only choice. She had glimpsed something older than the city itself, older than any mortal empire, and she had almost unleashed it upon the world. Exhaustion weighed her down like chains, but her heart was also lightened by relief. She left the site with a silent vow never again to chase knowledge into the dark out of mere curiosity. In the years that followed, she would sometimes wake in the blue hush of night, drenched in sweat, half dreaming of the robed figure's ancient grin and the faint hum of runes stirring dead flesh to motion. She would rise from bed, haunted by whispers of that dead language, the long-forgotten threat echoing anew in her sleep. Even so, the city remained peaceful, the monstrous secrets buried and entombed. On nights of restless slumber, she left her apartment and strolled the quiet streets, feeling the pavement solid beneath her feet, a comforting barrier between herself and the darkness below. And though she carried heavy guilt, she also harbored a flicker of hope that they had, at least for this lifetime, saved the city from the evil that had lurked in the hidden vault. Still, every so often, Eliza would glance at the horizon and feel a prickle of unease, as though that which rests in the shadows can never be fully laid to rest. Some acts, once set in motion, might only be delayed. Yet each dawn brought a renewed resolve within her. She would maintain silence. She would guard the city with her forgetfulness, sealing the black sarcophagus and its dreadful magic away in memory. And if ever the call of forbidden knowledge tugged at her again, she offered a silent prayer that she had learned enough caution and humility not to answer. It was enough to know, whenever the nightmares descended, that the darkness beneath the city would remain entombed. Perhaps, in the hush of those tunnels, the glyphs might glow faintly still, waiting for the day another unfortunate soul would ignore all warnings and choose to open that which was never meant to be disturbed.